Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I'm going to tackle one of the Ajax mechs, which is from Anvil Industry. This one is a 3D print, came off of my Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, and it is available through the Anvil Digital Forge. At the moment that's up on Patreon, but you'll be able to pick those up later from the Anvil website. Now painting big giant stompy monster robots like this is easy, so what I'm going to show you today is actually quite a quick method. I wouldn't call it truly speed painting, but it's real fast. And hopefully you'll agree with me that the results are, well, pretty striking. It doesn't have to be perfect to look like a cool stompy robot. So without any further mucking around, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, as well as the base recipe. Let's get started. So once you've printed off, cleaned up, and assembled your miniature, you'll have something that looks like this. I've gone ahead and I've primed him with a spray of the Army Painter's Matte Black, though any black primer will do. All right, it does not matter. Black is black, as far as a primer is concerned. Our first step beyond the primer is I'm going to get here some gunmetal from the Army Painter, and just any rough old brush that I can really go to town here. And I'm going to start applying this quite roughly and fairly generously. I'm just going to smash it over the whole miniature. There's no reason that you couldn't prime this with a metallic paint instead, but I think this is going to give us a slightly different texture. And texture is what I want to talk about when it comes to using the Army Painter metallics, because these have a slightly coarser grain, it feels like, than the Citadel line. So if you wanted to use lead belcher here instead, for example, you could, but I think the slightly chunkier grain is going to give us a different finish, a different texture to our metallic. So I'm going to go ahead, apply this all over the miniature, and we'll come back in a couple of seconds once that's done. And once that's settled, I've got a little bit of Necron Compound on large brush here, and I'm just going to dry brush downwards fairly generously. What I'm looking to do here is just to pick up some of the highest points of the metallic details, particularly along the minigun and such, just to make those a little bit brighter when it comes time to shade this. Don't need to worry about the legs too much, but hands and helmet and what have you, pay close attention to those. Once you've got everything a little bit shinier, it's time to pick a color. Now, there's no reason you couldn't prime this in a color that you want to use and then just paint in the metallic bits, rather than the back to front way that I'm going to do this. A little bit of it has to do with style. If you look at modern military gear, like tractors are a really good example, the whole thing is just sprayed in green. You know, the blades, the dozers, all that sort of stuff is just sprayed. There's no visible metal stuff on most military equipment. For our sci-fi and fantasy looking dudes though, that doesn't look quite as entertaining, so we're going to swap it up a bit. I have here some grey blue from Vallejo, and this is very similar to something like Space Wolf's Grey or the Fang, but as you'll see, covers much better. So what I'm going to do is, with quite a rough brush, just pick out some areas, shoulder pads, the chest piece. I'm just going to go around and start laying on a color. Of course, there's not really a correct answer for what color you want to use, but I think a nice light blue. I haven't painted something like this in a while, so this is why I'm going with blue. Now, particularly on the chest piece here is what I want to show you that I'm doing. Instead of swiping the brush down and very carefully covering over the whole area, I'm going to lightly stipple towards the edges so I get a slightly imperfect edge where that paint is. And we'll see why a little bit later on, but you might have an idea what I've got in mind here. All of that is just one coat of paint. Now that took me about 5 minutes, and I did honestly switch on down to a smaller brush to get into the back of some of the areas and some places like the back of his hands. But don't worry too much, we are going to fix things up as we go. A lot of this we do want to look pretty rough. Anyhow, I'm going to move on now. I have some Iron Warriors, which is a nice dark gunmetal color. And I'll let you guess what I'm going to do with that. I probably didn't need to dry brush the chain gun as a result, but I'm going to pick out a couple of areas I want to darken down a bit. So the chain gun's a good choice for this. We'll paint in the housing in this darker metallic color too. Same too, this doubler, this little wrist-mounted launcher on his side here. Now, at the moment that won't look thoroughly different, but it will look quite a bit different once it's shaded. So keep the faith on that one. I've now got a little Balthasar gold, and what I'm going to do is pick out just a couple of smaller areas that we want to look like quite a dark brassy color once they're shaded. This is something where I don't want to go overboard, but a couple of small areas, just to add a little bit of visual interest to what we're doing, is going to break up that blue and silver quite nicely, add a little bit of warmth. Now, you'll probably notice I'm not being terribly careful as I'm applying this. I'm not worried about edges or little spillovers and what have you. We're looking for quick. Try not to let yourself get bogged down in the amount of detail that these things have. Just impressionist is what we're looking for. Still using metallics, I'm going to use some Retributor gold and paint in the face mask. And then the tips of the rockets, I'm going to paint in red. I have Mephiston Red here. Nothing says high explosive ordnance to me like red tips, but that's up to you. Now, painting in those rockets gave me an idea. I have here some Corax white, and this is a bear of a paint to get to work. It does need an agitator in there, and I've added a little bit of Lahmian medium into my pot. But once it's all shaken up, and you will need to shake the dickens out of it, what I'm going to do is apply a couple of stripes on the shoulders here. Now, it does not matter in the least if I make any mistakes here, because what I'm going to do is block in just with short, sharp flicks. I'm going to block in the shape that I want the stripe to be. If I go a little too far in one direction or the other, I can just tidy up with that original color, the grey-blue we used. So we're going to put one stripe up on the shoulder, and I'm going to do the same thing down here on the left knee. Little short, sharp flicks, just to bulk out the shape that I want this stripe to be. Now what I'm going to do is turn back to my Mephiston Red, and I'm going to do the same thing again. Small, sharp lines, just flicking roughly where I want that stripe to go. Now I want a thinner stripe in the center, but just as with the white, if I go overboard in either direction, I can tidy up with the white. Ooh, goodness me, this always makes me nervous. You see how quick that goes from, oh yeah, that's a robot, to, oh yeah, future sci-fi crazy anime robot. I love stripes. It's really easy to do. Definitely a skill worth practicing. So I'm going to tidy them up now because I have made a little bit of couple of splotches. And I'm also going to do a little bit of tidy up on places like the mask or up near the rockets. And that's really all of the base coats that I'm going to do. And with any last minute tidy up done, any last coats you want to finish, it's time to shade our miniature. Now for this, what I'm going to use, this is based on the Forge World Army Painting team's Magic Marine Juice. So this is equal parts Nuln Oil, Reikland Fleshshade, and Lahmian Medium. I just got one pot of each, put them into a big container, shook them all up, and then put them back into the 3 pots I'd emptied. So I've got a lot of this, but it's really good. It's got a nice warm tone to it. It's not quite as dark as Agrax Earthshade, and it's not as red as Reikland Fleshshade would ordinarily be. It's really quite nice. You could use Agrax Earthshade here instead if you wanted a simpler solution. That's just going to give you a darker finish overall. But I'm going to load up my brush, and we are going to very generously start bucketing this all over the model. Now, because there are so many neat little nooks and crannies on this dude, make sure that you are working it in there with your brush. But yeah, just jam it all on. And then we're going to leave this to dry for about half an hour. Now once that's dried, you'll see that the medium in there helps to make it settle a little more smoothly on flat panels, and we get plenty of shading on all of our metallic stuff, which is looking really cool. But if you thought I was going to paint a miniature without turning to some Agrax Earthshade, haha, you don't know me very well. So I've given that a good shake, and I'm going to apply this to the rotary cannon and the little slug thrower thingy up on his wrist there, because I want these to be much darker. Now while that dries, we don't actually have to wait for this one. We're going to paint some other areas instead. I've got some white scar, and I'm going to very carefully highlight these stripes here, Don't worry too much if you don't get this perfect, but I want to brighten them up so that they stand out a little bit compared to the rest of the armor. Using some Evil Sunz Scarlet, I'm going to do the same thing to the red stripes. Now, don't worry if you don't get the whole thing perfectly covered. Honestly, a little bit of the darker color towards the edges of the line will look super cool. I'm going to introduce you here to one of my favorite tools. This is a scabby old brush that came out of the stationery aisle. These really nasty, cheap little brushes are brilliant because they don't tend to come back to a decent point for very long. So what you have is nice scriffly ends, which are really good for weathering. And that's what we're going to use this for now. So rather than painstakingly highlighting every panel on this machine, goodness me, that would take forever, I'm going back to my gunmetal from earlier. What I've done is scrubbed most of it off as if we were dry brushing, and I'm going to lightly, very carefully drag this raggedy brush towards the edges of some of those areas that I would ordinarily edge highlight. If I get a rough edge, all the better. Up on the shoulder pad is probably a better place to show you this. Let's drag against that edge, and I get very quickly, oop, there might be a little too much paint on my brush, but I get this battered, as if the paint is starting to show through again. So I'm going to lightly do this to pretty much all of the blue armor. Very carefully, very lightly, at first, just flicking ragged silver edges instead of edge highlighting. That will not take long to do at all, and as well as dry brushing against the detail, you can also tilt your brush in and stipple in some areas where you want a little bit more of that silver just to ding those areas up. What I have next, this is a little bit of Vallejo red leather, which I have watered down, about 6 parts water to 1 part paint. Don't worry about this specifically. You can put too much water in, and once this is dried, come back and give it another coat. What I'm going to do is just roughly drip in towards the edges of some areas where I want it to look as though water and grime has collected. I've got a slightly rusty surface. Now this is quite fun, because while you're going, you can just smudge it around with your finger if you think you might have too much on, and get a really grimy effect. This is a lot of fun to apply. Same as with your metallic stuff though, it is possible to very quickly go overboard, so I'd suggest those bits that you've dinged up, just dab a little bit of this on the bare metal, and yeah, have some fun with this. And once that's dried, you'll have a really cool grimy effect, which looks like it's settled in areas where wet, dirty rustwood. I've been a little more sparing with it on things like the metallics. I think it looks a little better on the blue where it will stand out more. And I've deliberately not put any on the weapon systems. I think those would be better maintained. From here, you could dry brush the weapons with a little bit of Necron Compound again if you wanted to brighten those up, but I quite like that really dull finish. So speaking of dull, I'm going to take him outside now and hit him with a matte varnish. I'm going to use the Vallejo matte spray. Always works really well for me. Then I'm going to go ahead, pop a base on him, and we'll see what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our Ajax mech is complete. And I have to admit, when I started putting the base on him and applying the tufts, he started to look less like a man-sized mech and more like a giant robot, which is kind of cool. So if ever you've wondered how I would approach Battletech painting, it wouldn't look terribly different to this, if I'm honest. So these are available at the moment via the Digital Forge, but keep an eye on the Anvil Industry website for when they become available in resin if you don't have a 3D printer at home. These are too cool to pass up, and seeing the Afterlife range get a second lease of life through the Digital Forge has been really cool. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me do cool stuff like this. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time on it all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.